Well, good morning, youth, although it's evening for me and when I'm recording this lesson. You know, there's a modern song by a musician named Matt Redmond that's called Blessed Be Your Name. I'm sure most of you have probably heard it. It's not, if you haven't, it's really worth listening to. It does a good job of balancing in the Christian life how sometimes we feel like there are chapters in our story where streams of abundance are flowing. And the other times, we feel like we're walking through the wilderness, as the song puts it. But either way, we must learn to say, "Blessed be the name of the Lord." The chorus says, "Every blessing you pour out, I'll turn back to praise. When the darkness closes in, still I will say, blessed be your name." How do we say, "Blessed be your name," in the difficult chapters of our story? Because that's a really hard thing to do. When the darkness feels like it's closing in on us and we're living out difficult chapters. How do we do that? Well, remember, we're using the Narnia books to help us to talk about the Christian story, the story of redemption that God has been writing ever since the beginning of time. It's the story of history, the true story of this universe, the main story that's going on and has been going all the time. And whether we know it or not, it's the only story that makes sense of the world around us. So we need to learn to live our own little stories in the context of the big story that's going on around us, God's big story. So we've looked at how this story shows us that the number one problem is sin. We've also looked at how the story shows us how we are redeemed by Jesus. We've talked about how we live our lives in the context of that story, by looking at what Christian basics, Christian character, how we change idolatry. Yet another thing we need to talk about is how we live in this sinful world when our stories start to take a really bad turn. Because we live in a sinful world, which means that sometimes our stories will feel like the darkness is closing in on us, like it is right now. So how do we live the Christian life even then? Well, Lewis helps us with that, with a chapter in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. When the Narnian crew is sailing, they come across the Dark Island. So in that part of the story, they're sailing and they come to an area of darkness, though even though it's broad daylight. They don't know how the darkness is produced, but somehow they come to an area of complete darkness. Now, at first, they're not willing to go in, but then after some goading from Reepicheep, they finally decide to take the adventure that is before them and go into the darkness. As they sail in, quickly the only light that they can see is the light of their own lanterns. And then soon they hear an awful wailing and screaming cry, almost an inhuman cry, of a man on an unseen island crying out for mercy. And he swims out to the ship and they take him aboard. The moment he's aboard, he tells them in a panic that they must flee. They must row as fast as they can and get out of there, because they are on the island where nightmares come true. When the crew realizes what this man is saying, their worst nightmares that they've ever had come back to their minds, and they begin to panic. Every man begins to think that the worst things that he's ever dreamed of are coming true. They hear the sounds of their nightmares. Eustace hears the sounds of a big pair of scissors coming at him. Rheinelf hears the sound of evil creatures crawling up the side of the ship. Caspian thinks he sees and hears some kind of demonic flying creature landing on the mast. Every man hears his worst nightmares coming true, and he believes they're coming true. So in a panic, they start rowing, doing whatever it takes to get away from the dark island. But the problem is that in the darkness, they don't know the right direction to go. They have no idea how they get out, so all their rowing is completely futile. They might be rowing deeper into the darkness or at the very island itself. And they quickly realize what this means. They might never get out. The stranger who they rescued out of the darkness cries out in a dark, terrified voice, "Never get out! That's it, of course! We shall never get out. What a fool I was to think that they'd let me go so easily. No, no, we shall never get out." And all this time, Lucy is up in one of the lookouts. And instead of panicking and trying to add to the efforts of the other men. She simply prays, Aslan, Aslan, if you ever loved us, send us help now. And then Lewis narrates, the darkness did not grow any less, but she began to feel a very, very little better. After all, nothing has really happened to us yet, she thought. And then immediately a beam of light breaks through the darkness and shines on the ship. Lucy can look right down the beam of light, and as she does, she first sees a cross, and then what looks like a plane, and then finally she sees that it's a bird, an albatross. It circles the ship, and as it does, she hears the voice of Aslan saying, Courage, dear heart. Caspian orders that they follow the albatross, and now, for all their rowing, they have a direction to go, and it begins to be effective. All their efforts begin to be effective, and soon they burst out into the light. And then, when they're in the light, they begin to celebrate with joy. And they start to realize that there was nothing to be afraid of. There never had been anything to be afraid of. Their nightmares were not really coming true, but the darkness was convincing them that they were. They set sail away from the island with joy. And then Lewis closes by saying that no one noticed when the albatross disappeared. Now, what do you think Lewis is trying to get across to us in that part of the story? I think he's talking about those times in our lives when we feel like the darkness is closing in. The world is dark because of depression, anxiety, or suffering. It might come to us because of hard circumstances. It might come to us because our own bodies are fighting against us and making it difficult to find hope. However it comes, at some point the darkness hits us. We believe our worst nightmares are coming true. And it's at that point that it's difficult for us not to believe that our nightmares aren't coming true. So what do we do then? How do we live the Christian life, our own little stories inside the big story at points like that? Well, that's what we'll talk about in the next video. But in the meantime, think about the story of the Dark Island. Even go read the chapter if you have the book. And then use that to answer the below questions. And we'll talk more on Friday. You think about that.